My name is Monk Rowe, and we're in San Francisco filming for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. It's a real pleasure to be talking with Dr. Denny Zeitlin this afternoon.
Nice to be here, Monk.
Thanks for fitting us into your, probably have a busy schedule.
Very busy.
Yeah. I've been listening to your music for a long time, and it always seems fairly experimental. Would you think of it in that manner?
About experimental, I do like to feel that I'm pushing my own envelope when I play, so that I am I'm trying to stretch the boundaries of what material I'm working with to try to come up with something fresh and to have it be organic.
Organic. Okay. I know you work with the standards, but you're also a composer yourself.
Yeah.
When you do a recording, in the old days an LP and now CDs, the people you're working with, either producers or record companies, do they like to see well-known tunes on the recordings as well as your own material?
I think that's varied over the years, Monk. Like when I first started recording for Columbia back in the early 60s, John Hammond, who was my producer, liked very much the idea of recognizable tunes plus originals. And that's not an unusual stance for a producer to take. But over the years I've had projects where I've done albums totally of original compositions and albums all of standards. And I think it really depends on the record label, what their predilection is at the moment. I generally like to do mixtures, because I think it's interesting to share with the listener what a musician does with a well-known tune in terms of how you might reharmonize it or arrange it, and how you will work the changes of something they're familiar with. They have a place to stand to listen to the music, so sometimes it helps them get a foot in the door. An original composition offers the musician total carte blanche of the territory he wants to cover. And that freedom is wonderful, but sometimes it's a little harder for the listener to get into. So having an album that has a balance of the two often, I think, is the best way to go.
Yeah. Jazz right now, I guess, sells about 3% of the recording.
Sounds like an optimistic percentage.
Yeah, I guess 3 or less is what I've heard recently.
Yeah.
In your mind, is there a reason that jazz is, let's say, more of a challenge for a listener?
Yeah, and I think our culture, unfortunately, as a large group, is evolving more and more into a kind of attention deficit culture. So that people's attention span is for a sound bite, a quick image on MTV, a repetitive hook composition, whatever the genre. But to get someone to sit down and really sink into, say, a 10-minute composition that has a number of parts and complexities and improvisation, small segment of the listening population willing to reach out and meet the music halfway that way. It seems like people are willing to reach out this much, not that much, as a group. It's always a big treat when we play a concert or play at a club where people, even if they came in doubting what they were able to do, sometimes the positive contagion of a live event where some others are getting into the music will help other people reach out. But it's disturbing when I think of the culture at large, how rather than progressing in terms of being able to embrace complexity, the culture as a whole seems to be going in the opposite direction.
Yeah. What's the number one cause of that in your mind?
I guess in some ways, if there's a lot of material out there that sort of panders to the lowest common denominator, and there's a certain inherent laziness in people, if they can quickly get some fast food, they may not want to sit down and have a beautifully prepared 7-course gourmet meal. They'll just gobble and go on to the next.
As if we're all so busy that we have to do that.
Yeah.
You know, that the media says that they only reflect the culture or what people want. and critics of the media say, I don't know, I think you're causing it to happen.
Sure, it's a very reciprocal kind of dance that
right.
goes
on. When you grew up in Chicago, can you recall the first, I know you came from a household that had a number of influences in it. What was the first music that made an impression on you?
My earliest childhood,
that you can recall.
It must have been something at home because there was a Steinway piano in the house from the day I was born and before. And so I imagine what I first heard was one of my parents playing the piano. Mm-hmm. Or playing some 78 recording of some classical music.
Yeah.
That's what I'm sure I heard first. And my earliest experiences as a player was as an improviser. When I was about 2 or 3 years old,
Okay.
I still have some dim memories of climbing up on the piano bench, often on the lap of whichever parent was playing, and I'd put my little hands on their hands, and I would go along for the ride kinesthetically to get a sense of what it was like to traverse a keyboard. And then I would stay up there by myself, and I would start playing stuff. And my folks gave me a tremendous gift by protecting me from formal study for a number of years.
Mm.
They sensed that I just needed time and space to just inhabit this musical world on my own terms. Mm-hmm. And just improvise and make up things and do stuff. And then, I guess when I was about 7 years old, I had a hunger at that point to formally study. And that's when I began to study the classical literature.
They were very insightful then.
I think so. I think they did just the right thing for me.
Because if they had, if you had tried to make you one of those 4-year-old little prodigies, it might have stifled you.
Yeah, it could have. It could have been terrible for me. And there was another juncture where they again made the right decision. After a few years of studying classical music, my teacher took my parents aside and said, "Well, now is the time you have to begin to groom your son for his classical musical career. He should be practicing 6-7 hours a day, and he shouldn't be playing baseball after school. He should be coming home and studying this instrument." And my folks looked at each other and thought about me and said, "That's not for him. That's not where his heart lies."
Yeah.
And they were absolutely right. I mean, I have great respect and admiration for musicians who have the gene for the reinterpretation of the written page. Mm-hmm. I don't have it. When I studied classical music, as soon as I would learn a piece, all I wanted to do was to take that material structurally and harmonically and rhythmically and use it in my own music. Mm. The idea of keeping a formal repertoire up and ready to perform left me cold.
No kidding.
I just had no interest in that.
By the age of, what age did you kind of realize, or was it always that way for you?
It was always that way. I would learn the music, but then I would be using it in compositions and other kinds of stuff and improvising off of these
So if
motifs.
you were playing a piece of Bach, were you at the point where you could look horizontally down the music and recognize the chord structures and those kinds of things?
Not formally at the beginning. I didn't start really formally studying harmony probably till I was in maybe 6th grade. So it was more intuitive what I was doing with the music. And even after I started to formally study harmony, my approach to the music has always been more of an intuitive one. Sometimes people imagine, because I'm a psychiatrist and a doctor, that that's a cognitively demanding pursuit, and I must be a real cerebral kind of guy. And it's really not very descriptive of me. My approach to the music, my approach to learning jazz was not a didactic one at all. It was like experiential. It was osmotic. I would go down to these clubs in Chicago and stay out till 5 in the morning and just soak it up. Grab a piano player after the gig. Come on, show me, what did you play there? How did you voice that chord? I mean, that was how I learned this music. Not from some school, not from some book. That didn't speak to me.
Well, your parents were okay with you staying out till 5 in the morning?
Another gift from them.
Yeah.
They really trusted me. I was tall, and in a dark room at age 15, I could pass for 21. And I had the requisite fake ID anyway. And so I would just go down to where the music was happening. I would stay out all night. It was a period in Chicago that was very open that way. This was like 1952, 53.
Mm-hmm.
It's when I started hanging out at these clubs. And there was very little Jim Crow or Crow Jim. So I could be the only white kid in this club, and nobody cared.
No kidding.
You know, they really welcomed somebody who loved the music and wanted to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was marvelous education.
And most of these musicians that you would collar for a few
Mm-hmm.
hints, were they willing to
I found
work with you?
everybody to be
Yeah.
tremendously gracious
Uh-huh.
and forbearing my early attempts
Yeah.
to sit in and play the music and stuff. I think Chicago had a wonderful vibe back in those days. I mean, now of course we know there's jazz schools at every corner,
Right.
in every town, but there were none back when I was learning this music.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way you learned it, by an informal apprenticeship.
Yeah.
That was the only way to get it.
Right. And there's a lot to be said for that, isn't there?
I think it's actually ideal for a music of this kind.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you could actually get tossed out of the practice rooms in some of the conservatories for. Who said it? Don Menza said playing swing was a misdemeanor and playing bebop was a felony. Or something. Oh gosh. Well, did you come to a point ever when your late teens or whatever, and maybe with your parents, where you had a career decision to make? Was there ever a thought of trying to make a living as a jazz musician? And when did your interest in medicine start?
Well, I think I know that my music preceded my medical interest, because I really was playing around at age 2 or 3. But it was only a few years later that I started practicing psychotherapy without a license on the playground,
Yeah.
in 2nd and 3rd grade.
Uh-huh.
I was fascinated with people and with families and what went on with people's minds and their emotions. And I would be a good listener, and kids would talk to me about what was going on at home and what was bothering them, and I would just listen. And I had a model early on. I had an uncle who was a psychoanalyst in Chicago, and he started talking with me about his work very early. And my mother had incredible psychological radar. She could just read people. Extraordinary sensitivity to nuances of emotional states and how people were put together.
Mm-hmm.
So those two influences were very strong in me. So early on, I had an idea. I wanted to be a doctor. My father was a doctor. I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I knew I wanted to play music. I didn't know exactly what shape my musical involvement would take or how public it might ever become, but I knew I was going to be involved in music all my life. But I didn't really set out, like in high school, that I wanted definitely to have any sort of big public career as a musician. I started playing professionally in high school, in jazz bands, and I started sitting in, but I didn't have big aspirations to start recording, for instance. And possibly that was influenced by a number of musicians who were then on the scene and who were recording, who were telling me horror stories about record labels, about how their music was subverted, how they weren't allowed to play what they really wanted, how corrupt the marketplace was. So that there was a kind of atmosphere created that the really pure artistic thing to do was not to even bother with recording.
Really?
So I didn't have big aspirations to record. All through college, I went to the University of Illinois, where there were lots of opportunities to play with good people. I mean, Jack McDuff was down there. Wes Montgomery was living in Danville at the time, and I used to do some sessions with him, and a wonderful tenor player named Punchy Atkinson, Joe Firentello, who changed his name to Joe Farrell, the tenor player who died all too young.
Yeah.
Wonderful player. Roger Kellaway was playing bass then in and around the University of Illinois. So there was opportunity to play with a lot of good cats. And then when I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, which was in 1960, I continued to get a chance to play and sit in places. There was a club called the North End Lounge that was owned by Gary Bartz's father.
Oh.
So I started sitting in there typically on weekends and sometimes even during the week and playing with Gary. I just loved Gary's playing, and there were some wonderful players that used to play with him. So I got a chance to sit in and keep the music moving along. And then everything really changed dramatically in terms of a step into a more public kind of musical life in 1963. I had a fellowship at Columbia University in psychiatry, a 10-week fellowship. And so I was living in a little apartment that I was just renting for that time. And Paul Winter, who I had known from back in Chicago and had heard me play and liked my playing, who had just recently begun to record for Columbia, and he wanted to get together, and I was visiting him at his place, and he said, "Denny, I want you to play for my producer at Columbia, John Hammond. He's a really wonderful guy. I'd just like to have him hear you play." I said, "Oh, Paul, I don't want to get into that stuff. I don't want to mess with these. Come on, Hammond is different than all the rest of these."
Yeah. Did you know John Hammond's name at the time?
No, I didn't know the significance until Paul then told me that he had discovered Benny Goodman and who else? Basie and
Dylan later and all that.
Billie Holiday, Springsteen, so many folks. So, sort of kicking and screaming, he dragged me to Columbia to play for John Hammond. And so I played a few tunes, and he said, "Gee, I really love what you play. I'd love for you to record for Columbia. You can come on in and play whatever you want, use whomever you want." And I, at that time, didn't know how extraordinarily lucky and unusual that was. So I just sort of slipped into recording in 1963. And so, because Columbia was a powerful label and it got a lot of distribution and exposure, it just opened up a whole bunch of stuff for me overnight. So I might never have recorded, perhaps, if Paul Winter hadn't grabbed me by the ear and dragged me into his office.
Were you known amongst your colleagues as, how do I say it, a little different, being that you had this other part of your life?
I think on both sides. Initially, very early on, some musicians, knowing that I was a physician and I was either studying to become a psychiatrist or after I'd actually become a psychiatrist, might say, "Well, gee, how serious is this cat about music?" And, some doctors not knowing me might wonder, well, how committed is he to the practice of medicine if he's out there playing jazz in these clubs and making these albums? But anybody who's gotten to know me has quickly understood how committed I am to both fields and how seriously I take them both. So it's really never been an impediment.
Who were the pianists that affected or influenced your playing, or were there any?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think most musicians start off being mostly affected by people on their instrument, and then they expand their auditory interests. For me, the very first jazz piano album I can recall hearing was an album my piano teacher brought me. It was a 10-inch MGM LP called "You're Hearing George Shearing."
Oh.
And I remember hearing that album and saying, "Whoa, who is this guy? Listen to that marvelous classical technique, and yet there's this wonderful rhythmic thing going, and he's improvising, and I want to hear more of this music." And so I listened to a lot of Shearing. Then she brought in some Art Tatum, and I listened to Tatum. I was very drawn early on to Dave Brubeck, Lenny Tristano, particularly Billy Taylor for his consummate taste and touch. And in terms of pianists that I heard very early on and was greatly moved by, I would have to say Billy Taylor would be very high on the list. There was a little club called the Streamliner in Chicago on the near west side. And again, because I was tall, I could get in there. And I remember just spending nights listening to the Billy Taylor Trio, and it just was wonderful music. Then I got a chance to hear Oscar Peterson at the London House in Chicago, which used to be a wonderful supper club. And remember not only being knocked out by Oscar, but even more so by Ray Brown, just the force and the drive of that playing. And I was thinking, gee, I hope someday I can play with a bass player like that. You know?
Yeah.
So I would say that those were my earliest pianistic influences, along with Bud Powell, because I heard Bud a little bit after I'd been listening to Billy Taylor, and Bud knocked me out too. But then I very quickly was listening even more to Miles and to Coltrane and Charlie Parker, and I loved drummers and bass players, and I played some bass and played some drums, played some high school and college type gigs on both instruments, because I wanted to get an idea of what all the instruments were that play in a trio, you know.
Yeah,
and I enjoyed that very much. And then a big influence was George Russell as a composer and as a theorist. And in fact, when I think back over my career in terms of pivotal moments with certain musicians that were most encouraging to me and most galvanizing for me, I think of my relationship with Billy Taylor when I was just 15 or 16 years old, his graciousness. At one point, my folks had his whole trio over to our home for dinner when they were in town. And I played music with my fledgling trio for Billy, and they played for us.
Oh, wow.
And it was just so warm and so encouraging, and I do remember his honestly saying that the life of an itinerant jazz musician was extremely arduous, and that he had a telephone relationship with his wife back then that was very painful. And he seemed to be saying, you know, be a doctor and enjoy your music. You know? And through the years, Billy has been an inspiration and a big support. When he first started doing some of his work as a DJ, he would play my albums and stuff, and then it was a big thrill a few years back to do a CBS Sunday Morning with him. And so he's a wonderful man. Then I think of my relationship with George Russell when I was in medical school on this fellowship in 1963, where I got together with him and studied his Lydian concept. But even more than studying the specifics of his theory, the opportunity to hang out with George and to feel his excitement about music and his excitement about what I was trying to do, the support of that was tremendous. And then there was a time after I finished my first trio album for Columbia, which was in 1963. This was an album called Cathexis. I had read a review in a blindfold test that Bill Evans had done, and one of the tunes played for him was a tune from my very first album for Columbia, where I was a featured pianist with Jeremy Steig. It was an album called Flute Fever. And Bill had really liked my playing on that. So I felt emboldened to call him up when I was in New York and say, Bill, I've just finished this trio album. I've always admired your music tremendously. I would love to meet you and have you hear this, and I would just love to get a critique, just whatever you would have to say about it. And he invited me over and listened to the album, and was just beautiful about it. I mean, Bill was always so comfortable with his own playing. I mean, even though he was very self-critical, but he knew his playing. So he didn't have to be competitive with anybody. He didn't have to get into putting people down or anything. So he just encouraged me to do my thing. He said, look, you know, I don't have anything to suggest except play your music. You're doing it. Just keep doing your music. And that was a tremendous encouragement from somebody I, again, admired so much. So when I think back, the meetings with those three people at different points in my career early on was very, very inspiring.
Yeah. It must have been a nice feeling when he recorded your composition.
Quiet Now?
Quiet Now.
Well, it was a nice feeling, but it sort of amazed me. I mean, I get impatient with tunes after a while. I mean, I don't have tunes that I tend to play for 20 years. I mean, I play them for a while, then I'll get into something else, whatever. So, and that goes for my own compositions. You know? for some reason, he never got tired of that tune. He kept it in his repertoire, and I'm told literally played it every night for 20, 25 years.
Wow.
Recorded it about 8 or 9 times.
That
Can you
is-
believe that?
Yeah, is amazing.
I mean, I like the tune, but
Yeah.
come on.
Well, I like the tune too, and I found it was been going in and out of my head today a whole bunch of times, knowing that you were coming here, and I was curious. I don't know if you can remember why you did this, but the idea of you had the first 8, and then taking that up a whole step was. How did that come about? Can you recall?
I just think organically, that's just the way I heard it. It
Yeah.
wasn't like, let's do something unusual here. Let's move it up a whole step.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Right.
wasn't the way it happened. It just,
Okay. Well, I like it, and I must admit that I myself have borrowed something you did in the last 3 measures of that thing, which I think is really
I'm
great.
flattered.
With the little phrase reharmonized 3 different ways. I think that's just, I don't know, there's something very emotional about the tune
Thank you.
that I think must be one of the reasons that he kept it on his playlist for so long. It does fit him well, I would say that. Why didn't you stay in New York?
I toyed with it. In some ways, it would have been easier to keep a higher profile musical career going had I stayed in New York. But back then, the vibe in New York I found too intense and oppressive. I have plenty of internal energy. I don't need that press from outside so much, and I hated the weather. I grew up in the Midwest with the extremes of temperature of Chicago, and by the time I left to go to medical school, I'd had my fill of blisteringly hot, humid summers and cold, austere, windy winters. I wanted a temperate climate. So when I had a fellowship in 1963, before this one in New York, which was to go out to San Francisco, to the Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute for the summer, I fell in love with San Francisco. The first night I was here, I had rented an apartment on the top of Twin Peaks, and I'm looking down over this whole city, and I'm thinking, boy, I may never leave this place. And when it came time to apply for internship, I applied to 6 hospitals in the San Francisco Bay Area, nowhere else. That was it. And I have never been sorry. I love living out here.
Just the first time for me, and I can see what you mean so far.
Yeah, it's been just right. Although certainly there's a sacrifice. If you live right in New York, where all that foment is, and there's a lot of business opportunities, always networking and stuff, it would have been easier to, keep a higher profile going. But I really was more concerned with the overall quality that my life would have, and the balance, and trying to maintain a balance. And really, at the hub of all of it, I feel is my life with my wife Josephine. We've been together for 35 years, and that seems at the hub, and then all these other things are, the spokes.
Did you meet her while you were? Let me do some math here.
I met her in '67.
Okay.
I actually met her at the Trident at a jazz club I had played for a number of years in Sausalito, which is just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And she came into the club one night. I'm playing there with my trio. I saw her come into the room, and I said to myself, this is going to be the shortest set I've ever played in this club. And I made a beeline for this woman. And just a few weeks later, we were living together.
Wow.
And it's been the best thing that ever happened to me in my life.
That's nice. Your work in psychiatry, has it been mostly in hospitals or private practice, or both?
Well, in my psychiatric residency, it included inpatient and outpatient work. But in private practice, it's strictly outpatient. And so I do intensive psychotherapy with relatively healthy people. So I tend to work with them over a long period of time. There are people in the world, they're functioning well, but they have psychological issues that they feel are getting in their way in some form. And our job is to help them remove those obstacles so that they can pursue their goals.
Yeah.
And it's endlessly fascinating work. It never gets old.
Has the practice of psychiatry, I was trying to make a comparison. To me, jazz has moved at a dizzying rate as far as it developing from one style to another, and just what has happened in 50 years even. And I'm wondering if the practice of psychiatry has moved in that quick a rate.
Well, there's certainly have been a lot of happenings since I was a resident in the mid-'60s. Been tremendous growth of the whole psychopharmacological dimension of psychiatric treatment. Our understanding of molecular biology and genetics has grown by leaps and bounds. Our understanding of what are the components in successful psychotherapy when you're talking with someone in your office, which is a large extent, it's the art of psychotherapy, but there is a scientific basis. And more there's research that really helps you understand how psychotherapy works. And I've been a member of a research group for 25 some years that's committed to studying the psychotherapeutic process in that way. It's exciting. It's very fascinating to see what it is that helps people change.
You must have pretty highly developed listening skills. Does it?
I think so. I mean, you get chops for whatever you do.
Right.
Yes.
Do you think it helps you in your playing in ensemble situations?
I think so. I think a sensitivity to all kinds of interpersonal dynamics can help you wherever you are.
I guess. I'm curious about, there seems to be a growing field of music therapy. You can actually study it in college.
Oh, yeah.
And is it something that that you know about or you feel is an effective
I've had
field?
very little experience with it, Monk. The experiences I've had mostly have been sort of self-designed and relatively informal. In years past, not recently, when I was in high school, I would take my band into state mental hospitals and play for the people who were hospitalized there. So that's a form of music therapy in that it activated them. They enjoyed it. They danced around. They felt connected in some way. There was an event I did many years ago for the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, which was a creativity marathon, a 24-hour event which we videotaped and then had people bring sound-making instruments, and we did improvisatory games and exercises and videotaped them so people could get feedback and react to the tapes, which would be taped. And it was a complex 24-hour event, which was a lot of fun, very exhausting.
Yeah, I bet.
Never repeated, but an interesting foray into that area. I mean, it is a recognized discipline with their own schools and accreditation, and I have respect for it, but I've never been drawn to formally get into it. I think the major indications for music therapy with psychiatric patients tend to be with the relatively more disturbed sector of the psychiatric population, which I'm not really working with. You see it more in hospitalized populations or in halfway house or daycare centers. It would not be so much an ongoing modality that relatively healthy people would partake of on an ongoing basis several times a week.
Right.
So what I'm involved in is a more intensive talking kind of therapy with people. It might still involve at times role-playing, working with dreams and other kinds of things, but it doesn't involve dancing, playing music, doing those sorts of things.
Do you think certain kinds of music can alter people's moods?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
no question about it.
If so, I'm wondering, sometimes we read about, usually like young people who have done something that their parents felt that they would never have done. And it gets blamed on the music they're listening to or the videos they're watching. Do you think that is a reality?
This is one of the most controversial areas where, people, there's a camp that says, the increased violence and disturbed behavior is a function of people seeing it on the screen, hearing it in the lyrics of rock tunes, and it just seeps into their psyche and they get the virus and they go do it. Or else they get desensitized to violence from seeing it as such a matter-of-fact occasion on a television screen, so life becomes cheap. And then there's other people who point out that we don't have any definitive studies that actually show a cause and effect relationship here. So it's very controversial.
Mm-hmm. How could you prove that? You'd have to subject someone. I don't know. I can't imagine how you would run a test to see if that. Well, one last question on this subject. Throughout jazz, it's unfortunately been a lot of musicians connected with drug abuse and alcohol and so forth. Is there a reason for that other than the fact that, a lot of times they make their living in bars and so forth, but is there other things that would make that come to pass?
I think there are other factors other than just the access and the social pressure of being part of a certain culture and to be like other people, and the emulation of idols. If they're using, then you want to use as you're coming up. But I think the life itself, the nomadic, itinerant life, plus the pressures of standing up in front of an audience and doing an emotional striptease night after night. For some people, that's really quite threatening, and taking various kinds of drugs may make it easier for them to get into that space. And I've known people, because of their own particular psychology, that clearly play better when they're on their drug of choice. And I've known people who, feel anxious and take the drug, but then it erodes their sense of form so markedly when they play that what happens is that there's a lot of heat but not much light in their music. So I think there's quite a spectrum of people in terms of how they use their drugs. And for some people, it really clearly seems to be adaptive for them. And for others, it actually impedes their music.
Yeah. I remember reading certain opinions about Charlie Parker, that he would not have been able to play what he did if he had not been, on heroin or something. And I hate to believe that. I just simply don't want to believe that. That's where that creativity comes from.
Oh, I don't think it comes from that. Again, I don't know how really the details of psychologically he was put together. I mean, if he were one of these people who was just so anxious or so internally conflicted that he needed some drug to at least stop that process long enough to be able to tap into his creativity, then maybe it did facilitate the work. For the large majority of people, in my experience, it's been an impediment.
Okay. Your work, composing work, in addition to Quiet Now, of course, has been appeared in some interesting places, including Sesame Street, in The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. How did that film come about?
The film opportunity came about through a back door. It's sort of analogous to the John Hammond story. It turns out that Philip Kaufman, the director who made Invasion of the Body Snatchers, was from Chicago and had heard me play years earlier, liked my playing, and had it in his head someday he wanted me to do a jazz score for one of his movies. So when Invasion of the Body Snatchers was just in the formative stages on the screenplay board, he called me and asked me if I would be interested in it. And at that time, the protagonist, played by Donald Sutherland, was going to be an avocational jazz man.
Oh.
And so it was going to be very easy for that to be the legitimacy for a jazz score.
Mm-hmm.
But then as the script evolved, he went from being a jazz player to a deputy public health officer, and now they wanted a 20th century classical musical score and electronics and everything. And I had no established credentials for doing that at all. So I had to convince first Phil that I could do it, and then a much tougher sell was to convince his producer, Bob Solo, that I could do it. I think if I had been in Solo's position, I wouldn't have taken a chance on me. This was then a quite expensive movie. You know, $5 or $6 million in 1978 was significant money. And I think I would have been tempted to go with an established pro who had credentials where I wouldn't have to wonder whether this guy's going to mess up the film. But Phil was so adamant about wanting me, and then when I think Bob Solo's sort of graceful way of hoping I wouldn't do it was to make me such an insulting offer that I would walk away in a huff. But I wanted to do this. I was willing to do it for nothing, for the experience. So
you called his bluff.
I called his bluff. I took it. And then it turned out, because of the way the movie was constructed and all the different instruments I was playing, I was playing all kinds of electronic keyboard instruments and all this stuff, and just the way one legitimately bills for services in union contracts, I ended up with a fair amount of money.
The doubling and all that.
Tripling, quadrupling. So, you know, the irony was I ended up being paid really quite well. And I had this unique experience of bringing to bear everything I had ever done in music, or wanted to do, because I wanted someday to write for an orchestra and figured it's never going to happen. When will I ever have the time to do this, or access to an orchestra to play it? And here I had a 10-week period to get this thing done. So for the first time in my life, I closed my office for 5 weeks. I had advance notice, so patients knew about it, and nobody got in any trouble. But it was a big step for me to close my office for 5 weeks, and then have it open for 5 weeks half-time. So I had some time over a 10-week period to work on this score, which was tremendously demanding, because I was writing for a full symphony orchestra for the first time, plus overdubbing electronic instruments and effects on that symphonic performance. So I'd go down to LA. There'd be a symphony orchestra that would play the piece. I would take the tapes back to San Francisco, and I'm sitting at the 10-voice Prophet synthesizer, which was state-of-the-art.
Yes,
back then.
I had one.
And it was going out of tune every cue, and I'd have to turn it off till it cooled down and turn it on again, right?
Isn't that amazing?
You remember that?
We think it's so primitive now.
But then it was the cat's meow.
Yes.
So I was using that and all these other keyboard stuff and overdubbing on those tapes. So it was a dizzying procedure. And I remember, I was working 18 to 20 hours a day on this. My wife would come down sometimes at 2 in the morning and scrape me off the piano stool, drag me upstairs and dump me into the hot tub to reconstitute. I mean, it was something. And so when it was over, I was thrilled to have had the experience and to get a soundtrack album out of it and everything. But it was so exhausting, plus some of the political and interpersonal things that happened towards the end involving actually getting paid. I said, once was enough. I'm lucky to have done it. I'm lucky that I did get paid because they wanted a soundtrack album bad enough, so money had to be forthcoming. I said, I'm quit while I'm ahead. Wow. Series of one. So when I got other offers to do it, I shined them on.
No kidding. I would have been very anxious going in front of a symphony orchestra of LA musicians, being it the first time that you've done that.
Well, you know, what I did is I was realistic. I amassed a wonderful team, and here I have to really thank Roger Kellaway, who had been doing movie scores for a number of years down there. And I called Roger. I said, look, I've got this opportunity. I don't know a damn thing about how Hollywood works with this stuff. Who do I need here? So it ended up, Roger conducted the orchestra for me because I'd had no experience conducting at all. I got Greg McRitchie to do the orchestration because he was a seasoned orchestrator who didn't have an ego. So he didn't have to feel he had to change any note. So I wrote out in the orchestral sketch every note I wanted to hear, but Greg made crucial decisions that I was not qualified to make, which would be, I might say, I want brass here, but he would decide how many trombones, and do we want French horns here too, and should trumpets be playing this same note an octave higher?
Yeah.
He was a master orchestrator, did a beautiful job. And I had a top musical editor who prepared the timing sheets for me, so I knew just exactly to a tenth of a second how much music was needed in every scene, and a top contractor. So I had a super team, the best LA musicians, because again, Roger told me all the guys to hire. And I had the best studio, a guy named Dan Wallen in the Burbank studio. This was the top soundstage. So for a guy doing his first film, I had this Rolls Royce opportunity. And I knew it was, I could do another 100 films and it would never be that good.
Right.
So that was it, man.
Okay. You cannot reproduce that.
No,
Let's just
no,
concentrate on
just
something
dumb
else.
luck.
Wow. That's great. How have your playing opportunities been since you moved out here? Do you get enough to keep you satisfied?
Yeah, I mean, it's a balancing act that I've had to accept all my life because I'm gripped by these two interests. It's always some measure of compromise when you try to do something like this. So I have felt that my task has been very much to find what is at the heart of each field for me. So if I can find the filet mignon of jazz and of psychiatry, then I have my best chance of being really happy. So I've renounced certain activities on both sides. In psychiatry, I don't do any administrative work. I do virtually no committee work or organizational psychiatric work. I don't do any inpatient psychiatry. I don't work with patients who are likely to be calling me at 4 a.m. dangling from the Golden Gate Bridge because they're intensely suicidal. So I work intensively on an outpatient basis with people who I know are healthy enough to be able to keep themselves going but have legitimate psychological issues they want to work on. I love to teach, so I teach at the medical school in the Department of Psychiatry. I teach residents how to do psychotherapy. And I'm involved in this research group I mentioned to you, which is very fascinating, and I teach under their aegis. So, and I consult to other therapists' practices and kind of help them if they get snarled up with certain patients. So that's the heart of psychiatry for me. I don't spend time writing papers. I've written a few, but that's not where my heart lies. In music, what I really love to do is I love to compose. I love to have a certain amount of performing opportunities, and I love to record and do a certain amount of international touring. But it doesn't make sense that I would expect that I would be out every weekend playing, or making 4 albums a year, or touring 10 months out of the year the way some of my musical friends do. That's absolutely not possible. What I try to do is to find a way to be with music every day in some fashion. So I try to get my hands on the keyboard every day, and it might only be for an hour or so. When I'm preparing for a tour or preparing for a recording, then it really ramps up in terms of the amount of time I'm spending. But there are certain days I might not get to the piano at all if I'm really immersed in some psychiatric stuff. But I try to keep my hands in and my ears open. And to do enough performing so I'm feeling I am sharing the music with people, which is a very important experience. There's something so wonderful that happens when you're in the proper setting with the proper musicians and the music is really happening and you begin to have this merger experience with the music where boundaries dissolve, The music is just happening. I feel like I'm just a conduit for the music. I know the audience is out there, and it's then like we're all in the audience listening to this music. When that happens, it's just exquisite. I mean, I wish I could say it happens every time I play. Doesn't. But the
It's
times
something to
it does
shoot
happen,
for, isn't it?
you
Yeah.
shoot for. You try to let it happen, because you can't consciously grab it.
Right.
But you try to find out what sorts of emotional states and preparation can you do that will invite that experience. So the performing really can be super special.
Wow. Well said. I had a question and you just made me forget it. That was so interesting what you were saying. Do you have people that, in your opinion, would be considered to be musical geniuses? I think that, personally speaking, the word genius is bandied about an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, in the people that you enjoy listening to over the years, has there been a couple that you would consider to be geniuses?
I agree with you that the word is so highly charged, and it would be so difficult to define. I mean, I do think when I think of the real incredible innovators and trailblazers in our music, I tend to think of people like Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, George Russell, Ornette Coleman, people like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's, Wayne Shorter is another huge giant in my view in terms of a kind of unique contribution to the music over a long period of time. I'm sure I'm leaving out people that I love, but because there's so many people that I admire, but those are some people that, at least at this moment, leaped into the foreground when I think of major people.
Okay. If I was to look, I'm assuming maybe you have a shelf of CDs or LPs.
So many I couldn't begin to catalog them.
Who would I find a lot of there? Who would I find?
Oh, you'd find all those people I mentioned,
Yeah.
plus hosts of other players. I mean, I feel I've been able to learn and get something from listening to virtually everybody I've ever purchased a CD or an LP of. And I have quite voracious appetite for just a wide range of music, from unusual ethnic music to classical music, ranging from Bach all the way to the most modern atonal kinds of things. And, some rock and roll I like a lot, funk bands and electronic music. And there's an awful lot of music I love a lot.
I know you went through a few years or a period where you were doing some prepared piano music.
There actually was a whole decade that I was immersed in a kind of a multiple keyboard integration of classical rock, jazz, and funk and electronic music. It started in the late 60s, around 67, 68, well before there were any kind of polyphonic synthesizers around, or even portable monophonic ones. It was maybe just as the ARP 2600 was coming out, but mainly it was Moog synthesizers with patch chords and stuff. And I got engineers to build me modules and things and ring modulators, and I gradually put together a rig that looked like a 747 cockpit. And there's 6 different keyboard instruments, stacks at right angles to each other, miles of chords and foot switches and foot pedals. It took 6 hours to tear this thing down from my studio, load it onto a truck, take it to the gig, play the gig, and then 6 hours to undo it. But I loved it, and for about 10 years, this was the way I performed and recorded. I did several albums of this kind of stuff, and it actually was at the time of my leave-taking with Columbia Records. They didn't want to embark on this particular journey with me. I can't blame them, because it didn't have much commercial potential at all. So I put out the first album of it myself on Double Helix Records. And so for about 10 years I was doing a lot of that kind of work, and that period really culminated with this Invasion of the Body Snatchers score in '78. So it was about a 10-year period.
Yeah.
And when that was over, I not only had enough of movie scores, I had a hunger for the purity of acoustic music.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years I did almost no electronics at all, just acoustic piano in various contexts. And it's only in this last year that I'm currently involved in a very interesting project with a synthesist and a recorder, a recording studio guy named Pat Gleason.
Oh,
Very
sure.
talented guy. He was, you may remember, it was the first synthesist to go on the road with a jazz
Herbie
group with
Hancock,
Herbie.
right? Yeah.
And so Patrick and I have known each other for a long time. Back in the '60s, he was the guy who first told me to take this chord and plug it here when I wanted to learn what a Moog synthesizer was about. So we're doing a project together, just totally on spec, which is kind of a piano concerto orchestral format where the orchestra is synthesized.
I see.
And we're having a ball. So it's my first big foray back into electronics in many years.
The toys have changed a
Oh,
lot.
have the toys changed? It's just amazing what's out there now. And I'm very glad to have someone who's immersed in it as thoroughly as Pat is, because it'd be very hard now to do all the music and all the electronics and all the recording yourself. I mean, God, it's...
You think back what a Prophet cost when it was in its heyday. I mean, for the same amount of money now, you can you can get an awful lot.
You can indeed, and yet it still ends up people like Pat who have studios like this. It's a multi-million-dollar expense.
Yeah.
When they really get into it, because he's got every sample library known to man and every kind of hardware bus and all the software and the microphone. Oh, it's endless. And it's a full-time commitment to know how to use a studio like that. He's constantly reading the updated manual for this latest software, and it's got 500 pages. And so it's a huge commitment these days to be up on that stuff. So to me, it makes sense to collaborate with someone like that. He brings that to the table. I bring the composition and the performing to the table, and I think something very interesting is happening.
Great. I don't know if this question is answerable in the short form, but is there something that makes one person more able to learn improvising than another? Or be less afraid of it?
It's a good question. I mean, I do believe that there is a certain inborn talent for improvisation that helps a person, if they're interested, if they can draw on that genetic advantage, that's helpful. But an awful lot of it, I think, is interest in it, access to opportunities to learn it, permission to have that experience, and not having any kind of psychological obstruction that gets in the way of allowing yourself to enter that terrain where improvisation is possible. And the kinds of psychological issues that frequently do get in the way of people doing that are people that have big issues about losing control, who have tremendous need for structure and reassurance that what they're doing every moment is right. And it's one of the things that makes it very hard for classical musicians to make a transition into also being able to improvise. They might play a wrong note. How do you know? You have all these possibilities. What makes that note better than another?
Yeah.
And they can be paralyzed by that.
Right.
Sometimes people who have a lot of talent, and I guess over the years I've probably worked with a somewhat higher percentage of performing artists in my private practice than other psychotherapists. And I've seen certain themes repeat that seem to get in the way of people being able to improvise well. One is this control issue that I've mentioned. Another theme is the fear of failure. people who have tremendous concerns about public humiliation, that they're going to do it wrong and they'll be blamed, or that they'll never be able to feel good about themselves, it's hard to take a risk. Improvising music entails a certain amount of risk-taking if you really want to get into something new. You have to be willing to break new ground. You have to be willing to fall on your face, to make an error, and for that not to be disastrous. For some people, psychologically, that's scary territory. Then there's another whole group of people with a different theme that gets in their way. People who feel very guilty about being successful, which is actually a very common theme in human life. People who feel on some level they don't deserve to be powerful, they don't deserve to be successful. Often it entails a belief acquired in childhood that for them to be powerful and successful means taking it away from someone else, from a sibling or from a parent that was hurting or a father that was depressed. So they end up feeling they have to hold themselves back. These people operate as though there's a governor on their motor all the time. They're able to brilliantly snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So those people have trouble getting up on the stage and letting themselves play as good as they can. They end up making mistakes, self-sabotaging.
Wow.
In the course of psychotherapy, they may be able to understand this theme and rework it and get freed up, and I've certainly had patients who were performers who have done just that. I mean, one saxophone player that I recall years ago who seemed to be getting criticized by the members of his band all the time because he wasn't playing well enough. But he brought tapes in for me to hear, and I could hear that he had tremendous talent. And in the course of our work, it emerged that he felt very guilty that he was favored over his younger brother as he was growing up. And because of that guilt, he felt he didn't have a right to be better than the other members in his band. It was as if he had siblings in his band, and he couldn't repeat this crime again. So he leveled himself, even put himself lower than his bandmates, even though he really was the best player in the band. And gradually, over the course of psychotherapy, he felt freed up from that belief and began to really unfurl musically, and he was out there on the bandstand kicking ass.
Wow. That is very interesting. And how long would something like that take? It doesn't happen overnight for a person.
No, it doesn't. It depends on how firmly entrenched the underlying belief is, and how traumatic the situations were when that belief was created in childhood.
Wow. So
So that there's a spectrum. But you're right, it doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes you get quite a bit of change in a matter of months. Sometimes it takes years.
Wow. It seems to me you have to, especially classical people, they have to redefine what a mistake is. If they're going to try to improvise, mistakes, the definition of a mistake changes a lot from classical music to improvised music. But sometimes that's hard to, it's easy to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. What's in the near future for you, music-wise? I know you're working with Patrick.
Yeah, that's one project that's going on. I've got a number of trio performances coming up in the next year. Most of them will be with Buster Williams on bass and Matt Wilson on drums. I've been really enjoying playing with them. I've got 2 CDs in the can from our last performance at the Jazz Bakery last fall, and I'm currently trying to market those. And I've got a couple labels that seem quite interested, and hopefully that'll be out before too long. I will be doing another West Coast tour with Matt and Buster in the fall. In January, I'll be at the IAJE convention with them.
I'll see
We'll be
you
doing
there.
some good, and we'll hopefully be doing some concerts around that. And then in the early spring, like maybe February or March, we're going to do a Midwest tour, and that should include a week at the Jazz Showcase in Chicago. Then I'll be going back to the Jazz Standard in May and doing some other East Coast things. And then in the summer, hopefully some stuff in Europe. So that's the touring with the trio. I also do duets with David Grisman, the mandolin player.
Yeah.
We did an album for his label, Acoustic Disc, that came out about a year ago. And he's wonderfully refreshing to play with. And so we do duet concerts periodically, kind of get salted in among his quintet dates.
Mm-hmm.
And I look forward to that. And then I do a certain amount of solo concerts every year, which is a special treat for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I love playing with people, but there's also a special challenge and delight in being the whole orchestra, which a piano can do under the best of circumstances. So I look forward to that. And then I usually do a couple of presentations each year, which I call Unlocking the Creative Impulse, the Psychology of Improvisation, where I talk about some of the issues we've talked about today, some of the psychological obstacles and what the nature of that merger experience is when you get into the music. What are some of the rituals and preparations one can get involved in that help usher in that state? And then I give examples at the keyboard and take questions from the audience.
Wow.
And it's a lot of fun. I do this
Great.
sometimes for music schools or psychology departments, and sometimes for just lay audiences, certain groups who are interested in the creative process.
Mm-hmm. If we had a nice grand piano sitting right here, and you sat down to improvise with no preconceptions in mind, how do you start? Is there something you decide to do to get started?
Usually what I try to do is to get out of the way. If I know I'm going to have to play, I get ready for a concert. Usually what I try to do is to find a way to clear my mind of other concerns. Sometimes that will involve me getting off by myself for a few minutes before I go up on the stand. And if I'm worrying about where did I put my plane ticket, and did I call this guy, and what time is that gig tomorrow night? I try to gentle myself out of those concerns. And one of the ways that works best for me is an internal reminder to remind myself how profoundly grateful I am to be able to play. That there is something about that moves me so much. I mean, even to say that brings tears to my eyes. It's like, I do feel so profoundly grateful to have music in my life that when I remind myself about this, the rest of these concerns they recede. And then I feel I'm ready to just greet music. And so if I then go out on the stage and there's just a piano there and myself, I just sit down and I just wait for something to happen. And something happens. You know, there'll be some phrase will occur, will just play itself, and then I'm just playing, and then I just stay out of the way. I try not to manipulate the music. I try to honor it, to just listen to it. Where does this music want to go now? What am I hearing? And if I play a note or a chord or a phrase that contains something other than I was thinking about, an error in terms of where I was going, I try not to beat up on myself and start castigating schmuck, what a dumb note to play. Because you start doing that, and then that messes up the next 4 notes or the next 4 phrases, then you beat yourself up for that, and that could start a real downward spiral in the music. So I think over the years I've gotten better and better at being just graceful with that. Just, I heard it. Sometimes you make wonderful lemonade out of a lemon. You can take that mistake, turn it on its ear, do something very interesting with
Uh-huh.
it, so that. And you talk to a lot of jazz musicians, and a lot of them will tell you they've come to love their mistakes on
Yeah.
record, because it really pulled them into something different.
Right.
They had to react in a different way to either legitimize it or to work with it or do
Yeah.
something with that clam that appeared in the line.
Right.
You know? So that's really ideally what my emotional state would be. Now, being human, I still have moments where thoughts intrude,
Uh-huh.
get in the way. I'll be playing and I might be thinking about something else, and I'll have to become aware that those thoughts have become intrusive and gently push them away, focus more purely on the music.
Well,
You know, if somebody coughs in the audience, rather than seizing on that and getting angry at the
Uh-huh.
coughing, or to not even hear it, it just goes
mhm.
over one's shoulder.
Does it help or hinder to think of the obvious places you could go? If you happen to land on a certain ninth chord, and in your head you know the conventional place for this to go is here, does that even enter your mind? And if so, do you try to ignore it, or?
I'm not really typically, when I'm playing, thinking about, ooh, here's a C minor ninth, which normally would resolve to. I'm
Okay.
not thinking that way at all. I'm having synesthetic experiences where I'm tasting the music, or musics have colors. Different scales and keys have different colors for me, and I'm
Mhm.
playing and I'm hearing the blue and the orange together, and it tastes kind of salty and rough, and I'm sort of awash in a lot of different sense impressions, and I'm just trying to follow what feels most authentic. Again, the idea of where does the music want to go,
Mhm.
not where I want to put it, but where does this music organically want to evolve? That's what I'm hoping to allow
Uh-huh.
happen.
It's a tall order.
I wish I could do it in a higher percentage of the time, but
But no
but
one
that's
ever
what makes it interesting.
Yes, right.
you know?
No one ever said it was going to be easy.
Right. I mean, that's the challenge of this thing, you know.
Wow. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation for me.
It's fun for me too, Mom.
Good. I don't know if you have to be somewhere, but we've talked for quite a while, so.
Well, I mean, I'm fine to leave it here unless you have any last questions you want to get into.
Well, I'll throw a couple words or phrases at you and see if they have any reaction. Duke Ellington.
I love the Duke's music. When I grew up, though, in terms of emotionally, I was more drawn to Count Basie's band,
Mm-hmm.
and there was something about the rhythmic unison feeling of that band. It was like one pulsing organism
Yeah.
that emotionally got to me even more than Duke's band and Duke's writing. This unquestionably, he's one of the towering geniuses of the music, clearly.
Right. Okay. Ken Burns.
You know, I didn't see that whole
Okay.
documentary. I saw some of the early ones and enjoyed learning so much about Louis Armstrong.
Uh-huh.
A lot of stuff I didn't really know, so I was
Yeah.
really pleased, and I saw that as a big plus. From talking to my musical colleagues, that apparently he left the last 50 years of
Yeah.
music history for an hour-and-a-half segment. I didn't even end up finishing it, so I can't comment on
Okay.
the sweep of the whole work.
Right.
I guess in his defense, he never pretended that this was supposed to be a definitive, balanced
Mhm.
history of the music, but an evocation of what spoke to him.
Yeah.
So, Godspeed. But
Uh-huh.
from my own purposes, from at least what I've heard secondhand, I do wish it had been more balanced.
Okay. Can you define swing?
No.
Would you like to try?
No.
Okay. Most people say no, and then they'll try. But as you said, go listen to Count Basie or something if you want to know.
What you do is you point.
Right.
point at examples of it.
Right.
Point when it's not happening. And then somebody with big ears could begin to say, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. What do you envision? I had said before I felt, jazz seems to move so fast. Is it possible to imagine where it will be 10 years from now?
I don't really think so. Because, we're about ripe for some incredible major innovator to come along,
Mm-hmm.
somebody of the status of a Coltrane. They don't come along that often.
Yeah.
I think we're ripe for someone to
Mm-hmm.
come and just blow the lid off this stuff
Yeah.
and open up a whole new direction that we're not even imagining.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be quite exciting when that happens.
Lastly, were you familiar with the records Ascension
Mm-hmm.
and Free Jazz?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what your reaction was to those things at the time.
Well, I loved it. I went through a period where I was doing only free improvisation.
Mm-hmm.
And my concerts would be just that. And some of those free improvisations would have tonal roots in them, and others would be totally pantonal or atonal. So I feel very open to that music. Again, it's a question of how well is it played? How organic does it feel?
Mm-hmm.
One of the traps is, as George Russell has been quoted, is that the avant-garde is the last refuge of the untalented. Because it'd be very easy for anybody to just pick up a horn and go,
Yeah.
and say, hey, man, he's really into it.
Right.
But there's, how much musical substance.
Right. No rules can be an excuse for
Right.
a lot of things.
Right. So when that music is well played, it's marvelous. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Well, I want to thank you for your time today. And
A pleasure.
Hope you'll sign my CD. And,
Be a pleasure for me.
and next time I
Hope you'll
try to play quiet now, I'll be thinking of you.
I hope you'll send me a copy of the videotape.
I certainly will. Absolutely.
Great.
Thanks a lot.